Welcome to r/RedditRevenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. And today we have 3 great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story. Company tried to get me to quit by treating me like crap. I left and took all my most valuable files with me. The second story. Grandpa just wanted to fix some cars. The local dealership got mad at him because he was crushing them, sued him, my grandpa got serious, put them out of business. The third story. Mr. Important called my number and annoyed me. I decided to show him my musical taste. Today's first story is Revenge on an Old Employer. I worked at a customer service call center. I was there for 7 years and created 33 new or updated documents for them to use because I'm highly trained in Microsoft Office programs, Word, Excel, etc. These documents were used at 3 different branches of the company in 3 different states. When I started having emotional problems and had to see a psychiatrist, they decided to get petty and tried to make me quit by treating me like crap, i.e. giving me the horrible shift hours, making me miserable, demanding I do extra work, and then stating I wasn't going to be getting our yearly raise because my work ethics had become erratic, though all my coworkers were praising me for keeping up with their ridiculous demands. Anyone who's had issues with a company who doesn't have to pay unemployment benefits and would rather force you to quit will be highly aware of the type of tactics companies pull when in this situation. I had originally put a watermark on all the documents, but when I became so emotionally drained from having to deal with their demands, and actually had to check into a psychiatric institution for a 48-hour hold, I had enough. I knew I wouldn't be coming back after I got out of the hospital, so right before I went to the hospital to check in, I deleted the only copies of 27 of the documents that were for internal use only, and locked the last 6 with a password that I gave to one coworker friend, who had already given her notice, and only had 2 days left. 2 days during a time that none of the higher managers were actually present because it was the weekend. I ended up staying at the hospital for almost 2 weeks, due to the emotional state I was in. During my 3rd day of the hospital stay, the company called my house 5 times trying to get a hold of me, to find out where I had put the missing documents, and what the passwords were for the locked ones. My family stated specifically that because they had driven me to the point of having to go into the hospital, there was no way they were going to ask me for any information that had to do with the company. After the 5th call, my family told them that if they called again, they would report the company for harassment and stalking-like behavior. One of the managers actually tried to call the hospital to get a hold of me several times, only to find out that I wasn't allowed to take any calls from anyone besides my family. On one call, the manager tried to pretend they were family, only to discover that my family had given the hospital a list of my actual family members, just in case someone from the company tried this tactic. When I got out, the company called me 2 days later. When I picked up the phone, the person that had called had been one of the biggest perpetrators in the way they had been treating me over the past month of my employment. I told her flat out that the documents were gone for good, as were the backups, and the password-locked documents were set to delete after a month when I'd locked them. When the manager said they were letting me go, I said, "Thank you for the unemployment benefits," and hung up on her. Edit. This happened back in 2013. I also got to hear some very amusing stories from some of the people who still work there about the managers having to try to recreate documents from scratch, with only limited knowledge of Office products, and no real memory of what they had on them. The documents I had created were fill-ins, and they could be tabbed from one section to another to add the information exactly where it needed to be. I had everything from drop-down menus for standard selections, tick boxes, Excel tables that had formulas, so the information or statistics were automatically calculated for them, and sections that copied to any other place on the document and table that was redundant, as all companies have on that type of paperwork. They had no one who was proficient enough in Office to make those types of templates, documents, or forms. The only reason that I was able to do it was because I'd taken a college course just before I started working there that strictly focused on Microsoft Office programs. Also, to those who were trying to warn me about how the company could get back at me, the company never came after me because they knew I had too much I could use against them for their treatment of me. I had documented everything, and made certain they knew it by sending copies of everything to the CEO of that particular branch of the company. They also ended up closing that branch of the company about 8 months after I left, due to some very serious accusations from several employees about the same type of treatment. Ironically, a couple of those employees called and asked me how to handle the situation, when they started having to deal with that same thing. I told them to document everything, even down to the most minor mistreatment. That way they had something to show as proof. I'm on SSDI now because my bipolar disorder, borderline personality, social anxiety, and PTSD got to be too much. After dealing with everything the company put me through, I just couldn't handle it anymore, and things compiled. I would have loved to continue working, but I just couldn't and can't get around my social phobia anymore. The second story is, don't want to let me tinker? Alrighty then, let's do business then. My grandpa was a successful man, And in his mid-60s, he decided he wanted to take a step back, so he started selling off his businesses. He sold various businesses and spent the next few years traveling. As he approached 70, he got bored in addition to a few new grandchildren, so he needed a bigger house. He sold the old home that he had bought after he got back from Vietnam, and bought this massive house on this large piece of land. This property also came with a massive steel barn. Not sure if he had ever told anyone about his plans, but right after he got a property, he dumped a ton of money into tools and equipment, and converted his barn into a mechanic's dream. Some things I remember having. He had a professional lift, capable of lifting full-size trucks. He had those professional oil catchers you see at Quick Lubes. He had a dedicated air compressor system that was designed to power all of his power tools. He had a tire machine to mount new tires. He had so much equipment. His tool corner was a massive corner of this massive barn. His plan? To fix cars, especially for people in need. He lived in a rural community. If you didn't have a car, that was a big problem. So he let everyone know at his local church that he was willing to work on their cars if they provided the parts. He only took a few jobs a week. He was doing this to enjoy himself and help those that needed it. He'd, of course, change oil, change the transmission fluid, and all kinds of various repairs. My grandpa was a talented mechanic. However, he kept the amount of work limited. He was also selective. If you were in need, he'd want to fix your cars. If you had the means to pay, he'd decline and ask you to go elsewhere. One day, the owner of the local car dealership came by and told my grandpa he needed to stop fixing other people's cars because he wasn't properly licensed, didn't have the proper insurances, and was hurting his business. My grandpa explained this is just his hobby. He only does a few cars a week. The owner told him he needs to cut it out, or he's going to sue my grandpa out of business. My grandpa said he laughed over this. What business was this guy going to sue him out of? The owner walked out. A little while later, my grandpa got served. He was being sued by the owner of the car dealership. My grandpa thought he'd take a trip down to the dealership and try and reason with the man. My grandpa hoped he could come to an understanding. My grandpa spoke to the owner and basically explained. He only works on people's cars who are down on their luck. The fact is, the people's cars he fixed probably couldn't afford to pay a professional dealership to fix their car. He only does a few cars a week. He's not all that interested in getting into a fight over his hobby, but he ain't gonna back down. Well, they ended up in court. By this point, my grandpa had hired a lawyer, who was able to get the city to approve a commercial garage on his property. It helped that he lived on the outskirts of town and had 6 acres of property. The court told my grandpa his auto repair shop is operating illegally. If my grandpa wants to continue, he's going to need to get a business license, get the proper insurances, and if he does, it'll be good to go. Now, what do you think a man who has nothing but time and money in this situation is going to do? He's going to get his business license and insurance, of course, which he did, and that surprised no one, but he went further. Got a dedicated phone line, ran into his shop, hired a full-time mechanic, put up a professional sign, set up a little waiting area with a water cooler. What shocked everyone even more? He ran a local TV ad, saying he was a pay-what-you-can mechanic shop, reservations only. Put ads in the local paper saying the same thing. Yes, folks, that's right, my grandpa is not only a licensed legal auto repair business, he has a certified mechanic on his payroll, and he's running ads. As for his prices, they were quite simple. You either bring the parts yourself and pay the mechanic whatever you wanted. Mechanic got a separate wage for my grandpa, so if you couldn't pay anything, that was fine. Had my grandpa source the parts, he'd charge at you parts and you'd pay the mechanic whatever you want. My grandpa started taking jobs, and boy did that shop get busy. It was impossible to beat Grandpa's price. Grandpa was essentially paying to fix your car for you. My grandpa would spend his days with the mechanic that he had hired working on cars. He loved it. The owner of the local car dealership was furious. He sued my grandpa again. They went to court and the judge basically said my grandpa owned a licensed, insured auto repair business. What he charges his customers for his services is completely up to him, even if that means doing the work for free. About a year or so later, my grandpa gets a call from a lawyer who says he's representing a potential buyer of the local car dealership. However, the buyer wants to speak to my grandpa. My grandpa agreed. He sat down with the new potential buyer, who expressed his concerns about buying the dealership. Service is a major profit center for a dealership, and he's considering buying the local dealership. However, he doesn't want to buy the dealership if my grandpa is going to keep operating the way he is, because it's impossible for a for-profit business to compete against someone selling their services for free. My grandpa agrees that there's no way someone looking to make a profitable business could ever compete against him, so they come to an agreement. The owner buys the dealership and my grandpa would only work on a few cars a week, maybe 5 to 6. Only work on people's cars who are down on their luck and probably too poor to be able to pay a professional dealership to fix their car. Any parts he needs, he will buy from the dealership. Any work he declined, he'd refer to the dealership. The new owner of the dealership agreed to. Dealership must agree to let my grandpa be, stay out of his way. Dealership must hire his mechanic. They shook hands. The local dealership was bought out, and for the next 9 years, my grandpa would fix people's cars who were down on their luck. If he had to buy parts, he'd buy from the dealership. And as for that mechanic my grandpa hired, he ended up becoming the service manager and did quite well for himself. As for my grandpa, when he was 80, he had a heart attack in his shop. Luckily, one of his grandkids was there and they got him to the hospital and he made a full recovery. But the doctor told him his body couldn't handle working in that garage anymore. He ended up shutting down after that. For the next 3 years, he looked out his kitchen window staring at his shop, remembering all the fun he had in his garage. He passed away at 83, surrounded by his family and friends. My grandpa was a successful businessman, but he always had compassion. He did a lot of things throughout his life for the benefit of others. The last story is, won't realize you have the wrong number? Let me sing you the song of my people. Almost 5 years ago, I was unemployed and sitting at home. The phone started ringing. Some middle-aged man asked to speak to my boss. And when I say ask, I mean ordered me to connect him to my boss like the drone he obviously thought I was. No please, no how do you do, not even a hello. So I tell him I don't have a boss, that this is a private residence and that he made a wrong number. Completely ignoring me, he went on a rant on how he was a very important person, and that he had something equally important to talk about with my boss, and then reiterated his request. So I just hung up. I was busy doing nothing and the rude person interrupted me. So naturally, the moron immediately calls back. Before I can say anything, he immediately goes in an angry diatribe about how he'll have my job, my head and my house, or something like that. He was apparently so important he didn't have to bother with being very clear. I hung up again. Needless to say, this went on and on. I could not just unplug my phone because I expected some calls from my future employers, and I didn't have a cell phone back then. I was basically a pleb. Should I call the police? Nay, this called for revenge of the petty persuasion. So every time Mr. Important could not possibly be mistaken would call, I would put the phone on an MP3 player with only one song in it, a French folk song entitled La Grosse Bite du Doodle, or Doodle's Big D in English. Yeah, believe me, it's as stupid, rude, and as gross as it sounds and more. Oh, and worst of all, it's catchy. Mr. Important was not happy to be introduced to my musical culture. As soon as the lyrics started getting vulgar, he would scream at the top of his lungs. I could hear him even though the phone was 3 feet away from me. After 2 weeks of this treatment, and as I was considering replacing the tune with a recording of me and 3 of my buddies singing other crass songs in canon, with the 4th friend playing the flute in the background, because F that guy, Mr. Important suddenly stopped calling. Never heard from him ever again. Maybe he finally understood how phone numbers work. Subscribe, hit the like button, and have a good day. See you in the next video.